Hey, good morning. This is a regularly scheduled meeting of the Baltimore County Board of Appeals. We're here at 9 a.m. on July 6th for a public deliberation in the case of Bruce and Freda Goldman, 6603 Pimlico Road, 3rd Election District, 2nd Councilmanic District. It's CBA number 22-032. And assembled here this morning for this deliberation is are Sharon Bernardi and Andrew Belt, along with myself, Joseph Evans. The question that we are to deliberate has to do with whether the petitioner is entitled to a limited exemption under the Baltimore County Code 32-4-106A6 and or B8. Just by way of background, the Development Review Committee reviewed the petitioner's submission, and it found that the petitioner was entitled to a limited exemption under B8, but not under A16. The petitioner is proposing to tear down two residences at 6603 and 6605 Pimlico Road, and then build a Orthodox shul that straddles the two property lines in the middle. That's the development that's proposed. The board approved that project, approved the project with regard to the residential transition area requirements and some other parking variance and some other minor aspects of the zoning petition, and we did that and issued an opinion about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So the petitioner in this instance called two witnesses, Lloyd Moxley of who's the development manager at the at permits, approvals, and inspections, generally referred to as PAI, and also Mitchell Kelman is a private civil engineer. Mr. Moxley testified that as to the application that was approved pursuant to B8, and Mr. Kelman, as an expert, supported the part of the petition that sought the limited exemption under A16. So I think that's the background. Have I left anything out that should be said in terms of the procedural history or the background? I should add as well that the protestants did not call any witnesses except for Mrs. Blumenthal, who testified essentially to the same concerns that she and her husband and other protestants had expressed in the zoning hearing. But to the extent relevant, the protestants did not call any expert witnesses. The protestants relied primarily on cross-examination of Mr. Moxley and Mr. Kelman, which is a perfectly legitimate way to go, I should add. But that was, in terms of how the case was teed up for our deliberation, that's where it stands. So I don't know if anyone wants to start. I'm happy to start, but if anyone has wants to take the lead, that's fine with me too.
I will defer to you, Joe, since you two, I think, were on the original case. I'm the
We,
new guy.
we were. And, this case, was heard in front of an administrative law judge first, and then it was heard in front of, I think it was, Ms. Bernardi and Mr. Sampson and myself. And we had 4 days of hearings. There have been extensive hearings. And I say that only because the difference between A16 and B8 has to do with, well, the most significant difference is that B8 eliminates the community input meeting and the public hearing. It exempts the development plan from that. And there has been extensive public input on the case. Now, I mean, if just because there has been public input doesn't mean that doesn't actually answer the question as to which of these provisions applies, if either applies. But I just want to say that in terms of the ultimate equities, the protestants have been heard, and their views have been considered. And to a great extent, their views have, or some of their views anyway, have been incorporated into the board's final decision. And also, I know that protestants probably bristled at this, but the congregation also took much of what the protestants in general were saying and incorporated it into their final plan. So in any event, from my own point of view, I did not think that the petitioner proved the 106A16 aspect of the application. That was supported by Mr. Kelman. The cross-examination was, I thought, fairly effective, and also Mr. Moxley and the county did not support it. I thought that was significant. I'm not actually prepared to spend a whole lot of time talking about that aspect of the case. It just seemed to me that it was not proven, and there are any number of reasons why it's not there in terms of my understanding of the situation. Not the least of which is there's nothing in the director's letter that discusses it, and there's no way for us to even examine what the thought process was. More on that later, but it just seems to me that that aspect of the application fails. Does anyone want to chime in on that?
I just, the point of clarity, Mr. Evans, too, is, which is unique, well, not unique, we do these all the time, but different from other cases, is that because this is a limited exemption, we're actually stepping into the shoes of the county decision maker per se. So there was recommendations, but the way I see it, basically, we're hearing the evidence and we're making a determination as to which exception is appropriate. While process is sometimes a lightning for us, as these decisions are made before us, the ultimate decision is ours, as we listen to the witnesses and why they believe the different exemptions might be appropriate. I too, Mr. Evans, and when I was looking at this, the testimony that was coming from the petitioner seemed to be most strong in supporting the B8. And that's using an independent interpretation, understanding the county process, but saying that the decision is ours. And it is noteworthy that the county recommendation also was for the B8. So I was going more in that direction too. I was also, again, we never fail to re-argue what is minor development, what gets a public works agreement and what does not. We seem to do this over and over again, and I have a feeling that we will do it over and over again. But again, sometimes this holistically, we're the decision makers, so it's just not what other people said in prior determinations. It's really about what was brought to us during the hearing through Mr. Moxley, Mr. Kelman, and we did hear lay testimony. And as you said, that not to say that's not appropriate, but we also heard cross-examination of those witnesses. One interesting point, Mr. McCann brought up the fact it was the Jacksonville case that actually was, I believe that's the one that was just withdrawn when it finally got to the development plan. But originally it was Mr. Garber's opinion that he wrote.
Well, I suspected as much. It sounded like one of his. Actually.
Yes,
but you were on the panel, and
I was on the panel, and I remember being swayed in that one as being the finder of the decision at the time, was that the Jacksonville situation somewhat different from this one as to the level of review that had already taken place at that time. There were some issues in Jacksonville, as you do remember, with wells, waters, gas stations, and things that had sort of a heightened sensitivity to those issues. While those things weren't dispositive, they were factors that made the board make a decision unique to those facts in that case. And Mr. McCann astutely mentioned that you did that time, and he was correct. But I do see the facts and circumstances and the history of this one being quite different. And also in this case, having testimony, not to say it's the end all be all, but county representatives and experts to sort of shepherd us through at least the workings and what's decided as a minor development and what needs a public works and what doesn't not. So, and I've spoken too much, Joe, and you didn't want me to, but that's.
No. I mean, I was gonna go to Jacksonville retail because I think it's highly significant here. And just so I don't like to sort of be coy here. My own personal view is that the petitioner's petition, that the limited exemption is appropriate under BA, Jacksonville retail notwithstanding. And I thought there were two huge distinctions associated with Jacksonville, in addition to what you've already referred to. The first is there was no county testimony in Jacksonville retail. As I read the opinion, there was one witness. I think it was Mr. Richardson, I believe. There was no county witness to explain the letter. And the letter was itself cryptic. I mean, it just had a conclusion in it. It didn't have any rationale, as does the letter in this case. Suffers from that same defect, really. And these letters should have an explanation in them. I mean, in a different kind of case, it would seem to me perfectly appropriate to, remand the case or disapprove the petition or something, because there's just a bottom line result given without there's nothing for us to review. And that was part of the Jacksonville retail, which I thought was actually quite appropriate. But in here we had Mr. Moxley. So Mr. Moxley was able to explain the situation and sort of provide flesh on the bones of this bare bones letter. So I thought that was a major distinction. And the other distinction, which is also very, very significant, is that the letter in Jacksonville retail, as I read the opinion, left open the possibility that there would be a public works agreement. I mean, it referred to that. I think specifically I don't know if I have the language right exactly in front of me, but it's specific. The letter specifically alluded to the possibility that there would be a public works agreement. And so therefore, the absence of any testimony about anything seems to me that there was a clear failure of proof in Jacksonville retail. But those two distinctions make it different than this case, because in this case, the letter doesn't refer openly to the possibility of a public works agreement. So I think Jacksonville retail struck me as a very reasonable decision by, frankly, three of the most senior and able members of the board. But I just don't think it controls this case for the reasons you said and for the reasons that I said. So then the question is, is this a minor development involving less than 3 lots? Because that is the only basis under B8 that we have. And minor development includes, and the only basis for that is a development without a public works agreement. So then the question is, and then a public works agreement means also a private works agreement. And so then the question is there a private works agreement, or is there the possibility of a private works agreement? And that's where one can really go down a rabbit hole in terms of the statutory language and the definitions. And I'll just say, for me, I looked at maybe, and then you have to go to the definition of a minor development. And then you have to go to the definition of improvements. And improvements has a list of things, the only one of which would be arguably relevant here is landscaping, because all of the other items that are listed as improvements are very significant things, like streets and drains and bridges and sewers and water lines and open space and stormwater management. I mean, these are big development projects, even if they're private. And the only one that is arguably relevant here, as best I can tell, is landscaping. And I don't think that the word landscaping in the context of improvements can mean the kind of landscaping that we often talk about in terms of our zoning hearings. I mean, we said that they needed to do some landscaping in terms of buffering and some minor things like that, and some aesthetics. But landscaping in the context of a list of these sorts of improvements is in almost every single case we have. I mean, the vast majority of our zoning cases involve some landscape tinkering, I guess I would say. And I can't believe that tilt in our decisions transforms every project into a potential private works agreement and public works agreement. That just doesn't seem to me to make sense. So I don't think that there are any improvements in this case that make it the kind of case that would generate a private works agreement and hence a public works agreement. And again, the director's letter doesn't refer to the possibility of a public works agreement. And in any event, Mr. Moxley's testimony, it seems to me that if the word improvements and the concept of landscaping is ambiguous, then Mr. Moxley's testimony stands for the proposition that the agency that's administering this views it in the way that I just described, and therefore, we should defer to the agency assessment of its own authorizing statutes and regulations. So I just don't think there's a justification for a private works agreement. I don't think there's a justification to find that if there were to be a private works agreement, either because of landscaping or any other zoning condition that we required, that it would lead to a public works agreement in this case. So that's why I ended up where I am, which is that the B8 was, if you run through all the definitions, all the statutory definitions, you end up with the conclusion that the B8 exemption is appropriate under these circumstances. And once again, what's eliminated is the community input meeting and the public hearing. And you know, again, not to, I mean, if B8 didn't apply, B8 didn't apply, but I wouldn't want anyone to think that the board has shortchanged the protestants in terms of them articulating strongly their position. I mean, Mr. McCann did an excellent job, and in point of fact, we rejected much of the petitioner's case in the zoning hearing and found substantial merit in what the protestants were saying. Just at the end of the day, we granted the petition, and there were significant RLUPA concerns here, and there were significant concessions that the congregation made that just carried the day in terms of what the law is. But people were heard, and their views were heard and respected. So anyway, I've rambled. I apologize for that. Anyone got anything else to say?
No, I only want to say that you both have gone through extensive analysis that's very well reasoned. I do also agree that B8 is applicable. I did sit on the other panel, and as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, we gave extensive consideration for the protestants, and I believe that the conditions have been met for B8 for the limited exemption for all the reasons before stated.
Mr. Belt?
This, in quick summary, breaking this down again to tenets of statutory construction, which we often fight about these days, is what we do. So I think it's clear that there can be argued there is some sort of ambiguity as to what is meant about when you need a public works agreement, when you don't need a public works agreement. Again, if there's an ambiguity, we can look outside the plain meaning or the text and try to get some guidance. In this case, as you had noted before, the expert testimony that we received and the other testimony came from county individuals that basically gave us their thought on how these things were applied in practice. That was of great value to the board. Not to say in another matter that a protestant could bring another county witness or another expert that might have a differing view of application that would cause us to look at it in a different light. But based on these facts in the testimony that we heard during our hearing de novo, sitting in the shoes of county review, I believe the B8 is applicable in light of what we learned from the witnesses and what we know about the project. So I also join in that final decision with my colleagues.
I mean, Mr. Moxley is just, I mean, it's hard to, at least in this kind of a case, it's hard to say that he doesn't know what he's doing and he doesn't know what he's talking about. It that he has massive expertise here, and so he's a weighty witness, seems to me. Okay, well, I guess we've decided then that the petition, that the director's letter, I should say, I kept using the word petition. That's actually a misnomer here, but the director's letter we find has been adequately sustained, and we will issue an opinion that affirms it. And then the development process can continue, and it's really got a number of steps to go, but what won't occur is a community input meeting or a public hearing with regard to this development plan.
Mr. Evans, not just for clear for language,
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe we sustain or we affirm. I think we grant.
We grant, okay. All right.
And the difference being is the value that we give the former decision, because as we sit de novo in this bizarre type of procedural thing that we're in, since we are sitting in the shoes of a director, we are actually granting rather than affirming or sustaining. You might think that's ridiculous, but as a young board member, I included such language in an opinion that did come back to me later.
Well, once burned, twice shy, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, well, those are, of course, well taken points, and we'll make sure that our opinion has the proper language in it to reflect that
Okay.
principle. I mean, I think it's a well taken point. So anyway, with that, unless there are any other comments, I guess we'll adjourn. Huh?
All right, folks. Good to see you all
Thank
this
you.
evening.
Good seeing you too. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.